Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the release of this year's State of the Nation's Housing 2023. It seems like the last few years when we released this report, we're dealing with some other new trial and tribulation in the housing market, this year being no exception, with significantly rising interest rates creating very difficult market conditions. But many problems persist that we've seen for years. We'll hear more about those in a minute. But before we get started, I want to thank our Policy Advisory Board, who provides the primary funding for this report, as well as the some 15 organizations that provide both financial support as well as important insights and perspectives to help frame the report and make sure that it covers the right topics and is true to providing an unbiased view of the state of the nation's housing. We're going to kick things off with a presentation of report's findings from my colleague, Dan McCue, the lead author of the report, and someone who's been doing this for many years now. After Dan's presentation, we'll be delighted to have with us Senator Scott Wiener of California, and then we'll welcome our panel to discuss the implications of the findings for the U.S. housing market and how we respond to these challenges. So with that, let me turn it over to Dan McCue for a summary of this year's findings. Dan, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Chris, and thanks everybody. Happy to share our results with you here today. Well, the story of the state of the nation's housing begins with the cooling of the housing markets over the past year. It happened along a number of dimensions. Sales were down, construction for single-family homes was down, but here we see a big measure, the rising home prices and rising rent. So the rent growth and home price growth slowed precipitously over the past year. More so for house prices, which we see in the dark line, going from about 21% growth last year to 1% this year. Story for home prices are more about how many areas around the country are actually seeing decline. Whereas for rent growth, also a pretty steep drop in rent growth, but more the story about slowing from about 15% growth last year to about 4.5% growth this year. Fewer places where rents are actually down. But overall, a pretty big slowdown on this metric. But when we look closer at house prices, that sharp, steep growth and steep drop in price growth kind of belies the fact that actual house prices are still very elevated compared to where they were just a little while ago. So here we see the line, the actual level of house prices, nearly 40% higher than it was entering the pandemic. This has, combined with the rise in interest rates over the past year, really been a big part of the cooling in housing markets. It really meant that those who might have had the money even to pay for that down payment may not have had enough income to afford the monthly payments on the median price home. So here I'm showing you the changes in affordability calculations for the typical terms that a first-time buyer would see. And up at the top, you see the big increase in the interest rate. See, even though the median home price in the U.S. from March to March went down by 1%, shifting down to the second to last line, we see the total cost with principal interest going up by $500 a month on that median home, 20% over the past year. And that's really, it's raised, the bottom line, it's raised the amount of money you would need on typical terms to qualify to purchase that house, over $100,000 now as of March 2023. And that's priced out a number of buyers. Our calculations show about 2 million renter households were priced out of the market. We also saw first-time home buyer or home originations drop by 20% year over year. And by the end of the year, we're down about almost 40%. So a big impact on entry into home buying. We see around the country, about a third of all metro areas that are covered by the National Association of Realtors median home prices, a third of those areas you'd need more than $100,000 a year to be able to afford monthly payments. So it's something that's shifted in a big wedge between although it's been up across the country, a big difference between the affordable places and the not affordable places, which has spurred growth. A lot of those more affordable metros are in the southern census region. And we saw a big increase spurred by the ability to work remotely, but a big increase in moves to the southern region, but also to areas of the suburbs, places that are a bit further away from workplaces that were enabled by the increase in remote work, but led by, huge growth in states like Florida, Texas, and Carolinas, but big losses in people moving out of places, higher, more expensive places like California, New York, and Illinois. The big rise in home values over the past few years has been a boon to current homeowners, with record high home equity levels, up by almost $8 trillion over the last 3 years. CoreLogic shows that the typical owner in the U.S. gained about almost $100,000 in home equity over the past 3 years due to rising house prices. So, but the rise in home value and housing equity means that you have to be a homeowner to get that, which really underscored for us the inequality in home ownership rates and the big gap between rates of white households, where you see here on the top, the home ownership rate of white households about 74% at last measure, compared to Black households and Hispanic households, whose home ownership rates were about 46 and 49%. So almost 29 percentage point, 26 percentage point gap in home ownership rates, was really indicating the number of households that have access to this rising home equity really differed along racial boundaries. And what this chart also shows is that had very little, if any, progress over the last 20 years, but even going back further in narrowing these super wide gaps in home ownership rates by rate. Switching over to rental markets, we talked about the decline in rent growth. Here's the decline in rent growth for high-end apartments versus medium and low end, the high end being Class A. So we saw the steepest slowdown was in the high-end apartment market. But we see in the low end less of a decline. And if you look back in time, we see that even though the rent growth is slowing, it's still rising at a pretty strong rate compared to what the rises were previous to the pandemic. So still pretty steep growth, but still tightness at the low end for the low end renters. Hope is ahead because here we see the number of housing units under construction and the largest record number of multifamily units under construction now, as we see in this dark line. The highest number of multifamily units under construction since the 1970s. But really, this construction is not going to do much to help the low-end renters. Only 5% of these units, new units being built, are affordable to the median renter. So it's really going to take much more time to alleviate the tightness for renters at the bottom end of the rental scale. At the same time, here we have the number of units affordable to the low end modest income renters. Units that are renting for under $600, which doesn't sound like much, but it's a third of the rental market. The number of units for this dropped by over a million between 2019 and 2021, and dropped by 4 million over the past decade. So it's really adding to the tightness of rental markets and the inability for lower income renters to find an affordable place to live. According to the Low Income Housing Coalition, only 55 units affordable and available for every 100 very low income renters. So the shortage is translated into a record number of renters with cost burdens paying more than 30% of their incomes on rent. And we also see here at the bottom the severe cost burdens, the number of renters pay more than 50% of their incomes on rent, also at records, nearly 12 million households across the country doing so as of 2021. There's been some time since 2021, but since that time, things have have remained difficult. We see as the pandemic era supports are ending, stresses are rising. Here we see a chart showing evictions relative to the normal level of eviction. So we see the federal eviction prevention programs that pushed evictions down during the height of the pandemic to just 10% of normal levels are ending, and evictions have crawled back such that, by the end of 2022, they are back to pre-pandemic levels, and those levels were so concerning then. People experiencing homelessness is up with more evictions, particularly unsheltered homelessness, which is up 35% since 2015, particularly large increases in states like California, Oregon, Washington, but also across the country, Tennessee, Texas, Arizona, all seeing disturbing increases in people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. As a result, states are stepping in to help. Fiscal recovery funds, the rental assistance program started out at $46 billion, it's 80% spent. So with federal protections ending, states are really stepping up and adding to federal resources to direct substantial resources to approach these problems. Other problems need significant investment, and we focus this year on the urgent need to invest in the housing stock for many different reasons. First of all, to minimize the damage from future disasters. More than 59 million homes are in harm's way in high-risk areas. 2021, $57 billion in damage alone. Almost 15 million households were damaged in that year. So, stronger codes, additional investment to minimize the damage, minimize the losses that are incurred when a natural disaster occurs, which are becoming more frequent. Also, the need to mitigate the impacts of climate change through energy efficiency, recognizing that residences are 20% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So we have, $9 billion in federal tax credits, $3.5 billion in weatherization on that end. But that's not all. The significant needs to address the housing needs of a growing population of older adult households. The number of householders aged 65 and over grew by 40% over the last 10 years. And the oldest, with the oldest baby boomers having turned 75 in 2021, the highest rates of growth are shifting to the oldest age groups. Already, 3.5 million older adult households are reporting difficulty navigating their homes. So it's going to mean significant investments in the homes themselves to prepare for the needs that they will face from this growing older adult population. At the same time, the homes themselves are growing older. Reports have called for estimated $150 billion in repairs are needed to the aging housing stock, just the repairs alone, to address the almost 10 million homes that are structurally deficient now, let alone the updates and upgrades that need to occur. And lastly, the urgent need to invest in the housing stock, to invest to reverse decades of disinvestment in underserved neighborhoods. And so this means, largely falls along racial lines, investing in communities of color in particular, while mitigating risks of displacement, that the current residents may benefit from the improvements and not be driven out by them. So in the report, we look at the ongoing segregation here, very visible in terms of the average white person living in a neighborhood that's 70% white, the average person of color living in neighborhoods that are 60% people of color. So very different worlds that so many of us live in from each other. So we look at HUD's new rule in 2023 on affirmatively furthering fair housing to proactively promote inclusive communities and to ensure that everyone has access to healthy homes and high quality neighborhoods. That's just a touch of what we cover in the report. We cover a bunch of other long-term policy issues through this report, many of which we'll talk about in the next hour. So with that, let me turn it over to Chris.
Great, thank you, Dan. Thanks for that great summary. And just echoing your point that there's a lot more in the report. I encourage people to go to the website to download the report. There's also a lot of data tables that we publish and interactive graphics that allow you to really drill in to understand how these trends are playing out in your market area. So we've been producing this report each year since 1988, 35 years now, with the goal of advancing our mission of raising awareness of housing issues and to inform industry advocacy and policy. When we release the report, we'd like to invite members of those different segments, industry advocacy and policy, to come to review the findings and share their perspectives, and importantly, to help identify what needs to be done to respond to the challenges we've identified. So along those lines, we're pleased and honored to have Senator Scott Wiener from California join us to begin that dialogue with this year's report. First elected in 2016, Senator Wiener represents District 11 in the California State Senate, which includes San Francisco and surrounding communities. He serves as the chair of the Senate Housing Committee, where he works to make housing more abundant and affordable, and has led the many pieces of legislation that I think are both significant and important for the rest of the country, which we'll hear about more in a minute in our conversation with Senator Wiener. It's wonderful, Scott, to have the opportunity to hear your perspectives on what we need to do about this. And so welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I also had to give a quick shout out to a fellow New Jersey, and I understand you're from the South Jersey. I'm from North Jersey. So just want to make sure that New Jersey gets credit for contributing to people leading on housing across the country.
Absolutely.
So having just heard from my colleague, Dan McCue, and presenting his findings on the state of the nation's housing, obviously, one of the ironies, I guess, of the fact that we do this report is that housing is ultimately very local. So when you hear the findings that Dan's presenting about the nation's housing, do they echo with what you're seeing in California, the challenges you're facing?
Yes, absolutely. Fundamentally that we have this profound shortage of homes, and that even if rent growth is cooling or home sales are cooling, the reality is when you look at the explosion of housing costs in recent years and decades, it's just been so explosive, and not just in places like San Francisco, really all over the place, that even if things, quote unquote, cool down, or decelerating, or whatever verb we want to use, there's still the housing costs are still obscenely high, and it's causing so many problems, including the fact that we're pushing people out of our major metropolitan areas. They're going to live in other areas, and remote work has enabled that to an extent. And I don't begrudge anyone moving wherever they want to move. But we also know that when people move away from metropolitan areas to other areas, that increases carbon emissions, it increases electricity and water usage. It's not always the most sustainable thing in terms of the long-term needs of our society. And so I'm fine with people having choices about where they live, but when we are effectively pushing people out of cities and larger metropolitan areas, it's not a choice. They just decide, I can't make a life for myself and my family here, so they move somewhere that is less sustainable. And so we have so much work to do. And yes, historically housing has been viewed as a hyper-local matter, and we need to stop viewing it that way. Yes, there should always be a local aspect to housing. Every community is unique, but we have to also view this at a broader policy level, just like we view water or education or healthcare at a broader policy level, and don't just allow every city to decide what it's going to do or not going to do. This is a broad societal need. It's having massive impacts around climate and income inequality and homelessness and so on and so forth, and we need to address it at a higher level.
Yeah, I think, if we leave this to the localities, obviously what's in the locality's best interest is not in the best interest of a broader region. And obviously, I think that's why we're seeing more states take action to try to address what do we need to do on a regulatory front to be able to make housing, as you say, more abundant and affordable. For those folks who are tuning in today who aren't from California, I thought maybe we could start off by having you talk a little bit about some of the key legislation that you've helped lead in California. What is it had been the focus of that legislation?
Sure. So in California, where we are in many ways tip of the spear in terms of, we pioneered the housing crisis in California, and we need to be very clear that housing crises don't typically just happen. Yes, and so historically a natural disaster or a war could obviously, have a very out of the blue kind of impact on housing. But other than that, our housing crisis in California was absolutely engineered with terrible layering of terrible policy decision over terrible policy decision over about 50 years. In California in the 50s and 60s, we were a state of about 15 million people, and we were building between 250,000 and 330,000 new homes per year. Fast forward to recent memory, we're a state of about 40 million people, almost 3 times the size, but our housing production collapsed to about 80, maybe 100,000 or so homes a year. So tripling your population, collapsing your housing production, and you wonder why we rank almost at the bottom in terms of homes per capita among the 50 states. And we did that by over time, starting in the 70s. First of all, downzoning. It used to be you could build multi-unit almost everywhere. And then in the 70s and 80s, cities methodically banned multi-unit construction in big swaths of their city. San Francisco did it, LA downzoned, and literally in the 80s, literally eliminated 1/2 of their zoned housing capacity in one fell swoop in the 1980s. San Francisco did something similar. Berkeley did it, cities up and down the state. And so it got to the point where 70+% of California's residentially zoned land was only for single family homes. 1 home per parcel. That creates an inherent math problem. And so we also, on top of that, even if you want to build something in California consistent with the zoning, we decided starting in the 70s, you're not allowed to just get a permit for, once we write the rules, this is the height, this is the density, this is the setback, these are the design standards. Instead of just coming forward and saying like, hey, I've checked all the boxes, can I have my permit to build whatever it is I'm building? We said, no, it's not good enough for you to follow the rules. Following the rules is only step 1. Now, on top of following the rules, you have to go through a discretionary, chaotic, hyper-politicized process that might take maybe a year, might take 5 or 7 or 10 years, where we're going to say, the rules don't actually matter. We know we said 5 stories. We might only let you do 3 stories, depending on who's yelling the loudest at a community meeting or a planning commission hearing. We're gonna just have this chaos, and your project might die, it might get cut in half, it might get fully approved, but you've now had to spend a huge amount of money over years and years. And so in addition to trying to fix zoning, which we've been trying to do through requiring more planning for multi-unit in more parts of individual cities, as well as state-imposed rezoning by allowing duplexes and fourplexes instead of just single family, we're also improving the process by having more and more ministerial approvals. Saying if you check all the boxes, if you comply with all the rules, you get your permit in months, not years. And that we've been starting to see some real success in doing that. It's a huge cost driver, huge source of unpredictability, and it delays approval. Another thing, we're trying to just reduce costs. There are some costs we can't control. The cost of construction materials, the supply chain. We need to ramp up our construction workforce. We have some control there, but not complete control. But we have cities right now are able to impose basically whatever fees they want on new development. And so in San Francisco, it's pushing $200,000 per unit just in fees and exactions. Some other cities are dramatically lower. It's the Wild West. We need to get a handle on that. We haven't done it yet. And we are finally starting to eliminate parking requirements and allow developers to provide the amount of parking that is appropriate for whatever they're building and wherever it is, instead of having minimums of 1 or 2 parking spots per unit. And my colleague, Laura Friedman, an assembly member from LA County, passed a major law a year or 2 ago, starting us on the path of eliminating these parking minimums. So those are a few of the things that we're doing.
It's certainly a good list. And as you said, they're starting to see some success. Can you give us examples of the legislation that you've seen the most success with so far? What's made the biggest difference?
A few things. First of all, in terms of process, I authored the law SB 35. It's a ministerial approval law, which we're trying to reauthorize this year. After a slow start, it started significantly accelerating, especially for affordable housing, where projects that used to take 2, 3, 4 years to get approved are now getting approved in 3 months. So in San Francisco alone, we've seen, I think, 2,000 to 3,000 affordable homes approved or in the pipeline for approval under SB 35. My colleague, Senator Nancy Skinner from the East Bay, who's a real housing champion, she authored a law, Senate Bill 330, that limits the number of public hearings that you can have, which is just a huge benefit. So no more endless hearing after hearing after hearing, and also puts strong constraints on downzoning. So you can't downzone for less density unless you meet strict requirements like upzoning somewhere nearby. So that has been a real win. I authored a law in 2018, Senate Bill 828, which completely restructured how we set housing goals for cities in California. Every 8 years, every city gets an allotment, a housing goal for the next 8 years, something called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA, by income category. There used to be no teeth in it. This is true of a lot of state housing laws passed in the 60s, 70s, 80s, no teeth. We've been putting teeth into all of our older state housing laws, our affordable housing density bonus law, our accessory dwelling unit law, ADUs. And by the way, we've seen a huge acceleration of ADU or in-law unit production in California. But in terms of those housing goals, the regional housing needs allocation, it used to be a joke. You would have the city of Beverly Hills in the last cycle received a housing allocation of 3 units over 8 years, 1, 2, 3. Other cities would get maybe 100 or 200 over 8 years. It was absurd. So we restructured that, and cities are now receiving dramatically more. I think Beverly Hills went from 3 to 3,000 units for the next cycle. San Francisco went from about 27,000 to 82,000. So a big increase, and that is forcing the cities to rezone for that capacity. So much more multi-unit dense zoning. So it's having a great impact in terms of sustainable zone capacity.
You know, it strikes me that a lot of what you're talking about is process, and it sounds like it's not necessarily sexy or got big billion-dollar price tags, but it's so important to deal with the nitty-gritty of the process and the rules that people have to follow. We've been doing this report for 35 years. In many ways, the problems that we're talking about are the same or worse than they have been. And I think one of the frustrations people in the housing space has is, while we look at these issues and see them as critically important for people's well-being, for the overall health of our economy, they don't seem to get political traction. And you came in 2016. I don't think California was spending as much time focusing on housing issues in the legislature back then. Why do you think it is that housing has had such a hard time getting political traction and addressing these issues?
Well, I think that's changing because we're in a crisis, and I have colleagues. I think it used to be up until probably even a couple of years before I got there. There were colleagues, legislators in parts of California, who didn't really perceive housing as a huge problem. That's totally changed now. It is now, we expanded the size of our Senate Housing Committee this year because more people wanted to be on the committee. We have more members who want to author bills and co-author bills. It's really, it's been a sea change. We still have the same fights with some of the local government. Sometimes we've had sort of a division among labor unions, although I think we're starting to heal that. But I think historically, people have just viewed this as not like an overarching policy issue, but it's just for every city or town to decide for themselves what they want to do and whether they want to exclude people from living there. But the crisis got so bad and so broad-based, and people saw the increase in homelessness. People, have seen the problems, and employers started getting involved because if you're a business trying to hire people and people can't afford to live there. So we've seen a growing coalition of business and labor, environmental organizations who are increasingly seeing the climate impacts of bad housing policy, because bad housing policy leads to sprawl, because it's easiest to get housing approved where there are no neighbors around to fight you. And so that means covering over greenfields, building in wildfire-prone areas, and pushing people into mega commutes. So it's been a and I will just say that the rise of the YIMBY movement has been game-changing. 10 years ago, I remember in San Francisco where it was born. I remember the person who sort of gave birth to it, a woman by the name of Sonia Traus, who started showing up at San Francisco Board of Supervisor meetings, yelling at us about housing. And people were like, what are you talking about? The system's fine. And it wasn't fine. It was broken. And I think some of us were really seeing that. But it has become an international movement. And I have U.S. senators who are asking to speak with me to be like, what are you doing in California? And I love that. And members of Congress, I love that there are members of Congress, like famous members of Congress, who are really into housing now. I love that in the last Democratic presidential primary, every one of them had to have a housing platform and talk about it. Should be a bipartisan issue. It's been quite bipartisan here. And if you look at the Obama and the Trump housing toolkit for states, they were very, very similar. Trump went a little crazy when he went on this whole racist, you're trying to kill the suburbs thing during his reelection. But before that, his approach was very similar to the Obama approach. So the politics have completely shifted, and it's a movement shift. And I don't think it's going to go back.
I think, as you said, California is the tip of the spear in the housing problem. And I hope folks are watching and listening about what kind of things need to be taken so they can act before it gets as bad as California's gotten to be able to build this broad coalition. One other piece of the coalition building I'm interested in your perspective on is, from where I sit, I often see that, we have a bunch of different segments of the housing advocacy world. We have people we have the YIMBY movement, which is new and been really powerful and helpful voice. We have the advocates for very low income renters who are advocating for subsidies. We have advocates for people trying to expand opportunities for home ownership. We have, the home builders and the realtors and all these different groups, but often seems like within the housing space, we're all fighting each other. So I think that, appeared in some of your early legislative campaigns, trying to get more, market rate housing built that's well located and the like, but it wasn't doing enough for the affordable side of the equation. So do you have any lessons or observations about how do we get people who have within the housing space to work together?
Well, it's all about intensive coalition building. It takes years. So let me tell you who the core sponsoring organizations are of my legislation to extend our housing streamlining law, SB 35 this year. We have the California Housing Consortium, which it has both below market rate and market rate developers. We have California YIMBY, which is one of the statewide YIMBY groups. We have the Inner City Law Center, which is they describe themselves as the law firm for Skid Row. Literally, they are basically legal aid advocates for homeless and very extremely poor people on Skid Row in Los Angeles. So we have a bill to allow religious institutions and nonprofit colleges to build affordable housing on their land. And we have faith-based organizations and affordable housing groups, and also the Inner City Law Center. So we've been able to build these coalitions. Now there are some tenant groups who do not believe in market rate housing. They want to see only housing for very low, extremely low income people. I respect many of those groups. I do not agree with them. I think we need housing for everyone, and we should not be telling the middle class or people who are low income but not very low income to screw off, which that's effectively what that is. We want to be building housing at all income levels, and that will benefit everyone. If I could just add one more thing.
Sure.
The environmental movement needs to be more engaged on housing. When I first got here in 2016, the Sierra Club was still opposing many housing bills, and vociferously. That has changed. The Sierra Club, has now has not been opposing our bills. And I really appreciate that. And there was a lot of work that happened within the Sierra Club on that. Some other environmental groups will sometimes support housing bills that won't be their priority, but they'll support them. They'll often just be neutral. Housing is a climate issue. It is because we know that transportation, which is linked inextricably to housing, transportation is basically the top source of carbon emissions. It's almost half of the carbon emissions in California. And if we don't get a handle on housing and sustainable housing, we're not going to be able to solve climate change. I want to note something significant that happened. Bill McKibben, who is one of the most respected climate activists on the planet, and has been in the environmental movement for many, many, many years, recently wrote an amazing piece in Mother Jones saying we need to stop it with the process for the sake of process and using environmental laws like CEQA or NEPA to kill sustainable housing, infill housing, to kill clean energy projects. He sort of embraced what we like to call an abundance agenda, saying we need more of the good stuff. We need more sustainable housing, more clean energy. We need more public transportation. We need more electric infrastructure. We need more of all of that. And we need to make it easier and faster and cheaper to create all of it. And we need to stop using process and particularly environmental laws to impede climate action. And that's what that is. And so when Bill McKibben came out and embraced that, and I met with him afterwards, it was an amazing meeting. He's just such an amazing leader and advocate. That to me is a potential sea change. And he took a lot of slings and arrows for writing that Mother Jones piece. And if you haven't read it, you should definitely read it. But we need the environmental movement to really deeply step up for the entire abundance agenda, including housing.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message. And the fact, I think the environmental movement has been anti-development because development was seen as against the environment, but there's good development perhaps and bad development. And we need all of this development that's going to make us a cleaner, greener economy.
Well, in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, there was a lot of horrible development that happened. In San Francisco, they were like tearing down entire neighborhoods. We were seeing freeways that were going up in very inappropriate places and other dams. And so I understand there was a backlash against the really bad, destructive development to say we need checks in place, we need public participation, we need process, we need environmental review. But that then turned into a suspicion of all development, right? That anytime a big bad developer came along and said, I want to build something, whether it's a home, housing, or transmission line, or solar, there must be something suspicious. They're just trying to make money off our backs. And so we need to be suspicious of it and either oppose it or bog it down in years of process. And that became a cultural thing, certainly in California, and I think in US, many parts of the US, and that it went too far. And so we're trying to bring it back to the middle, where we say, let's make it easy and fast to build the good things while still slowing down or stopping the bad things.
Senator Wiener, we're almost out of time here, but I feel like I'd be remiss with given the homeless challenges that California faces. I didn't ask you about what's on your legislative agenda to address homelessness, which is so pervasive and problematic.
Yeah, I mean, housing is the fundamental solution to homelessness. I mean, California has 12% of the US population, but 30% of the US homeless population. That's not because we have more mental health problems or more drug addiction problems than other states. In fact, it's the opposite. We know West Virginia has far more addiction than California, but far less homelessness because housing costs are dramatically lower. And so the work we're doing about creating housing at all income levels, including at the lowest income level, I think is the ultimate cure. We're also working for what we know, particularly on the street, that there is about 1/3 of people who are homeless have substance use problems. And we also know that folks have mental health issues. Not everyone, but certainly a portion of the homeless population. We have been working to dramatically expand access to treatment for mental health and addiction by forcing insurance companies to cover more to cover more services, but also by making public investments. And I want to commend Governor Newsom for really leading on this with new approaches to try to get people into mental health and addiction treatment, including 2 ballot measures that the governor is supporting and that I hope we will place on the ballot next year to generate far more resources for housing and for mental health treatment beds for those on our streets who are in crisis.
Terrific. Senator Wiener, I know you have to probably go off and get on the floor of the Senate, but we appreciate you taking the time to share with us your perspective. We appreciate the work you're doing in California. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. With that, let me introduce Samantha Field, who's a journalist with Marketplace on NPR, who will be the moderator for our upcoming panel. Samantha, I'll have you introduce the panelists.
Sounds great. Thank you, Chris. It's wonderful to be here, and I would love to invite our panelists, they're doing it already, to turn on their cameras and join us. Joining us today, we have Chris, of course. We also have Adrian Todman, Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have Rachel Heller, CEO of the Citizens Housing and Planning Association. And we also have Clark Ivory, CEO of Ivory Homes, a national home building company. Welcome to you all. Thanks for being here. I'd love to start by asking you all the same first question, and we can go in the order in which I introduced you. We'll start with you, Secretary Todman. I'm curious, what stands out to you, what really stood out to you as new in this report? As Dan was mentioning, as Chris was mentioning, a lot of the issues in here have been around for a long time. And so I'm curious, this year, at this moment where we are with housing, what really stands out to you as new?
Great. Thank you, Samantha, and congratulations, Chris, for another great report. Chris is right. We do come across some of these issues year to year, but what stood out for me in this year's report were a couple of things. First, the good news of the impact that we had on trying to prevent evictions during the pandemic. I think that there's a lot of people that did a lot of work, both from an advocacy standpoint, but also just from a practitioner standpoint, do everything we can to keep renters in their homes, but also homeowners in their homes as well. So I think that is something we should lift up and, quite frankly, learn from. I think the millennial households finally forming their homes is another standout and one that allows us to think about some of the generational impacts to what our housing policy needs to be.
Those are great, and I have follow-ups for both, but I'm going to move on next to Rachel first. What stood out to you as new or really sort of particularly interesting in this year's report?
I think there was a lot in this report. The widening gap between those who have and don't have is astonishing. We're seeing that those who are fortunate to own homes are really benefiting with the highest rates of home equity, and rents are softening at the top of the market, where people have more resources and more choices. I'm glad to see that this report shines a light on homelessness and people who are living in places that are not intended for human habitation. So it's clear that we need more homes for the health of our communities, our states, and our nation. And is this a moment that we ask ourselves, what do we want for our future? And seeing housing as a piece of that.
Clark, I'd love to hear from you.
I thought it was a great report, very comprehensive. The issues that I thought were most at the forefront were we're going to have a lot of challenges bringing on the needed supply of housing in the U.S. And there's several things that we can look to. Construction costs are just going through the roof, not just vertical costs, but the development of new land, the horizontal costs, the city costs, the regulatory costs. The length of time it takes to get to market through the regulatory process. All of these things are headwinds, but probably the largest headwind is interest rates. And the rise of interest rates, I think, is actually understated a little bit in the report. I think you'll find, even though multifamily has been really still very strong this year and last, it's going to be very weakened in the next 18 months because these projects have a sort of a long horizon to come online, and no deals are really getting done right now because the rates just don't allow these new, particularly multifamily deals to pencil. And so we're also a multifamily developer, and we normally do 3 projects a year, big projects a year. We'll do one, and it's because you have so much more cash requirement up front with these higher rates. And I think the thing that the report wasn't going to talk about, because it's new this year, is regional banking crisis is going to have a real impact on, you know, the overall number of deals that are financed. And that's going to be sort of tough on supply. My dad's always taught me to watch supply more closely than anything else. And I think it's going to be tight ongoing.
A lot to follow up on there too. Chris, would love to sort of hear what you have to think, given that you are so in this report.
You know, it is hard because we're so in this report. It's hard to say what was surprising. And I may get in the weeds a little bit. Two things I want to point out. One is the trend in population growth. Last year, one of the headlines was the fact that the population growth in the US was at the lowest level in a century, if not ever. And that was natural increases had really fallen off a cliff, both because we lost so many people to the COVID crisis and because people had stopped having babies, and immigration had ground to a halt. So we had almost no population growth last year, which is astounding as a country. So one of the things that struck me was how it has rebounded back. Thankfully, we need more people in this country to be able to fill jobs and the like. But what's coming back fastest is immigration. But it's not coming back to the levels it was before. And I just think I would just want to really point out that even though right now we're in a really tight supply situation, 10 years from now, given our demographic trends, we may see a big slowdown in household growth. It'll be really hard to fill jobs. And so I think we really need to put a pin in what are we doing about immigration policy, because Clark can tell you how hard it is to find workers. And so we really need to think about this as a really comprehensive strategy. And the second thing is, I just want to, it's not necessarily new, but the report put a lot more attention on racial segregation this year. I think it's an issue we don't talk enough about in the housing market, and how much people of color and white households don't live in the same communities, and how the communities where people of color live tend to be underinvested in to a great degree. And so we really need to lean into both making sure that people have expanded opportunities to live in a broad range of communities, and that we target investments to communities that have been subject to that underinvestment and make those more thriving communities.
I have a lot of follow-ups for everyone. I want to stick for now with affordability. And Chris, I'm going to stick with you. And then if anyone else wants to jump in on this too, I'd love your thoughts as well. Dan was talking about, and the report talks a lot about, just how much worse affordability has gotten, particularly for sort of first-time buyers, people who would like to be first-time buyers, maybe aren't able to be, how much worse it's gotten in the last couple of years of the pandemic, this pandemic housing market, but in particular the last year, which with, as Clark mentioned, higher interest rates. Can you sort of put that in context for us? How much worse are we talking about? How much harder is it for people to afford a home right now?
A whole lot, to be concise. Now Dan ran through some of the numbers, and he was using as a jumping off point last March, which was actually already several months into the rise in interest rates. His example he showed had interest rates at 4.2%. They had been at 3%. So if you go back to the beginning of that rise in interest rate cycle, the increase in mortgage payments has been astronomical. It's gone from less than $2,000 to more than $3,000. As Dan showed just in the last year, that shorter time period, 2.5 million renters have been priced out of the market. And so Rachel's opening comments about the difference in the high and the low end, the widening gap between the haves and have-nots, I think we're in danger of having home ownership becoming the province of just the very well-to-do or the children of the very well-to-do. And I myself, I'm a strong proponent of home ownership as a way to provide people with financial security and a place that they can call their own and adapt to their needs. And if we become a country where that rung of the ladder is out of reach for more, it's really troubling.
Samantha, I'd like to jump in on that one. We understand sort of the affordability crisis as it relates to rental and home ownership, and what the impact of interest rates right now in our home ownership. People who want to become homeowners rather. And it's one of the reasons why HUD took a historic move a couple months ago in reducing something that the mortgage insurance premium, a MIP, which had really not been done before by the department. And it was our way of responding to some of the additional affordability pressures out there, particularly for first-time homeowners. And it reduced our upfront fee for people to be able to access our FHA insurance, which is one of the critical tools for first-time homeowners and for people of color as well.
I'd love for you to sort of expand a little bit more on what HUD has been doing and what more you think the federal government can do to address this. Obviously, it's a complex issue with a lot of different players, and I'm curious where you see the role of the federal government here and what else maybe whether either HUD or other parts of the government could be doing.
Right. With the multiple parts of the federal family that deal inside of the homeownership ecosystem. I mean, certainly there's HUD, there's our partners at USDA and VA, and certainly our partners at FHFA. And we are all working together to try to make sure that we are putting the federal government's push behind helping the American people. Let me give an example of that. I talked about the MIP reduction, which is something that is in place right now. But in addition to that, we realize sometimes access to some of our own FHA insurance tools, which are, again, primarily helping first-time homeowners, is something that has been a barrier. So some of the things that we've done over the past several months to a year is taking a look at using positive rental payments toward determining applicants' creditworthiness. We've taken a good hard look at the impact of student loans and really recalculating how student loans are impacting people as they're looking at their creditworthiness to access our FHA insurance tools. Our friends at FHFA has created new tools to help low-income families, moderate-income families, and people of color also to create access to Fannie and Freddie's tools as well. In addition to that, we are doing everything we can on the supply side. I know our Mr. Ivory has talked about, that there's a slowdown probably coming on the multifamily side. We are anticipating that and looking at ways that we can fine tune our tools here. But one of the things that I thought was promising just yesterday was that there had been a surge in the single family starts, which looks like there's been some, builders are understanding the high demand that's out there for homeownership units and answering that call.
Clark, I'd love to turn to you and sort of get your reaction to some of that. And also, as Deputy Secretary Todman was saying, there was a surge in housing starts that we saw yesterday that happened in last month. But my understanding is from the report and from other reading that I've done is that a lot of what's being built is at the higher end, both in terms of homes and in terms of apartments. And I'm curious if you can sort of talk both about sort of why construction does kind of lag demand and need, and also why in particular it's so hard to get sort of more entry level or middle of the road housing built.
There's a few questions in there. First off, there were some good numbers reported yesterday, but we've had a really challenging 6 months in terms of starts. And so we're just starting to see a little bit of a rebound. And still, I think when you see 2023 versus 2022 for single family starts, it's going to be incredibly low. And so we're having some challenges there. I think, the very high end seems to have not been impacted that much. Those buyers are not as interest rate sensitive. They have much larger deposits. The challenge is really for the first time home buyer and the first time move up buyer. What I'd say both affordable and moderate housing is a big challenge in our marketplace. And there's just been so many factors that have impacted costs. I mean, we just talked about interest rate. That by far is the biggest, factor. I mean, and this was mentioned in Chris's report, but your monthly payment on the same price house is 50% more than it was a year ago because of the way rates have moved. But the other thing that's just really pressing on costs is that we just don't have the needed labor. And Chris also mentioned this, the last Great Recession, 08, 9, 10, 11, 12, just left us decimated in terms of an industry. We saw so many trades leave and go into other industries. And then we have that coupled with an aging trade workforce. A lot of those folks are retiring, and the new generation coming up is not going into the trades. And so we have big shortages. We just cannot get the houses completed. Even with these slower start numbers over the last 6 months, we've really struggled to reduce costs substantially. In the last downturn, we were able to see costs come down dramatically. This time around, we're not seeing costs come off. In fact, I just came from a meeting with my purchasing department, and roofing materials are still going up this month. Concrete still going up. We still have so many of these areas where we're seeing increases. And then the city costs are getting to be enormous. The standards that they're requiring us to build to are more and more. Every year we see them added, and we see larger fees. I love sustainability, and we're going to talk about this maybe later. We're doing a lot to sort of innovate in this area, but a lot of the things that are being required of us cost a lot more too. So there's a trade-off. And so we're just seeing a lot of different impacts that are really coming down on that first-time home buyer and the person needing something moderately priced. It's making it very hard to achieve.
I just want to do a quick follow-up, and then I have a question for Rachel, but I'm curious, and this is probably a very complex answer, and maybe there isn't a straight answer to it, but do you see any solution? Like, is there anything that you can see governments at any level doing that would make a dent in this, that would help reduce costs, or at least, help you either or first-time home buyers?
Well, we heard from the senator in California earlier. There's a lot of things being done in I would say, several states, and iRenovations is looking at this, our nonprofit, where they are both streamlining the process for entitlement, but also, sort of requiring more of a regional approach to planning, so that there is greater density that's sort of getting pushed down on the municipality. Those two things, along with sort of equalizing development standards, will all have an enormous impact, so that one city is not requiring you to do something that's so much more expensive than another in terms of road cross sections, sidewalks, everything you have to do, utilities. There's a lot of different things that can be done on a city level to really rein in costs. And we're starting to see states that are stepping forward and looking at the municipalities and saying, we've got to do something here so that you are more in tune with affordable and moderate housing. So,
Rachel, my understanding is Massachusetts has been doing some of that, both at the state level and sort of at the city and town level. There's some interesting work going on that front to try to sort of encourage more housing and more sort of dense housing, affordable housing. I'd love to hear about it a little bit.
Yeah, Massachusetts has a long commitment to affordable housing. We're one of a handful of states that have our own state public housing, our own rental assistance programs. We actually have 3 in addition to Section 8. We have our own state low-income housing tax credit. The legislature invested $1 billion out of the recovery funds that came during the pandemic into housing and into programs like the Commonwealth Builder, which is it's a homeownership production program in communities of color. So really starting, narrowing the racial homeownership gap, and created a great new program called Mass Dreams, which is down payment assistance to help people get into homeownership when it is such a challenging environment. But even with all of these tools, the costs are going up. Like Clark said, we have labor shortage. We have all of these material costs that are going up. Another big reason we're having so much trouble is our housing shortage and the long approval processes to build anything other than single family homes. So even with a lot of resources, you can't build what's not allowed. In Massachusetts, we know we need 200,000 homes by the end of this decade to stabilize home prices and rents. But stabilizing prices that are too high for too many people means that we really need to focus on and resource affordability. You can get so far with zoning, you can get more moderately priced homes. When you can put in resources, now we're cooking. Now we can get to the deep affordability. So we just had a state law passed, biggest change to zoning in 50 years. It's requiring 177 communities that are served by transit to zone for multifamily housing, to set districts, and the state guidance sets numbers for each community, how much communities need to allow. So that is really important. I mean, we got here through intentional housing policies, and it's going to take intention to get out of this. So I do think, in addition to having, just making it possible to build homes, again, focusing on affordability and directing resources there.
One thing I'm thinking about as we're talking about affordability is sort of who are we talking about it for? I mean, who has been in the last year, couple of years, most affected by this skyrocketing, rise in home prices? Which I think, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's home prices are on average about almost 40% higher than they were before the pandemic. I mean, that's enormous, right? We're talking, of course, always about sort of the lowest income renters, prospective buyers, but middle income people at this point are priced out of many places too, right?
Absolutely. I know that Senator Weiner made reference to the fact that the coalition of dealing or recognizing the housing crisis has gotten so broad because the problem is affecting so many people. So the YIMBY movement arose in San Francisco out of, college educated folks who couldn't find apartments they could afford. So I think it's been valuable in terms of a political coalition that this problem has become so ubiquitous. It's affecting, as you say, would-be first-time home buyers and people who just are in the rental market. But as Rachel said, there's still a need for deep subsidies. And so my question is to Senator Weiner about that kind of those different factions within the affordable housing sector. We need all of these things, right? We need to free up zoning and regulatory processes to build more. We absolutely need to build more middle income housing. But we also need to devote more resources to make housing affordable for the lowest income households. And so my one concern with that growing coalition is the voices that are hardest to hear are the poorest households who have always had the least political juice. And so may get lost in the sauce. If we're focusing solely on zoning reform, which is important, it's not going to address the problem for those poorest households. And as much as they haven't seen the problem get worse, it's only because it was so horrible to begin with, it's hard to get worse.
Right. And Deputy Secretary Todman, I'd like to sort of throw that to you because I know a lot of HUD's focus, of course, is on the lowest income renters and prospective buyers or home buyers. I'm curious sort of what you've seen from sort of where you are about how the housing market of the last few years, the last year in particular, has affected the lowest income sort of renters and buyers in particular.
No, thanks for that. HUD has heard the voices of the folks who earn the lowest incomes here in this country. I had a great opportunity to visit with Rachel and her colleagues in Boston not too long ago and saw some really intentional work that they have in Massachusetts and in Boston proper. What HUD has done is multifold. One, so for the first time in decades, we have an increase in the voucher program. The last time that there was net new vouchers was when I was here in the mid-90s. And so to have waited that long to get brand new vouchers that's available to people who are homeless, people who are at risk of homelessness is kind of a big deal. And we've been able to deploy 100,000 vouchers across the country, not enough. And that's one of the reasons that the president's budget has included hundreds of thousands of vouchers asked, because we know the need is so great. In addition to that, we're doing everything that we can to make sure that we are dealing with the supply side. We know that vouchers need to be used with homes, and we hear all over that many of these units are not there. And so to that end, we're always fighting for more dollars in the home program, which helps with affordability toward construction costs. We're doing everything we can to deploy our community development block grant program for adaptive reuse. We know that there's a big interest in office to residential. Those community development block grants can be used toward that end, and we hope people are doing that. And one thing that came up very briefly in the state senator's remarks is the impact of disasters. One of the things that's so critical as we're looking at making sure we are keeping homes and building homes for the lowest income households is the impact that climate change and disasters are having in taking away some of the supply that we have. And so HUD does have a program to help states and localities as they are impacted by these severe events to be able to build back homes and build those homes for some of the lower income families most impacted.
I want to get more into climate change in a little bit, but I just want to follow up on something you just said, which is that, I had talked to a couple of different people after some of the most recent hurricanes down in Florida about what sort of happens in the aftermath when a lot of homes are destroyed or severely damaged. And somebody, actually former FEMA director Craig Fugate, was saying that often what ends up happening is the most affordable or the lowest priced homes don't get rebuilt because the people who live in them don't have the money to rebuild them. And so somebody comes in and builds a fancier home, and then that affordability is just gone. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about sort of how big a problem that is, and sort of how much more we're seeing that given the increase in extreme weather.
No, we certainly see an impact on low-income renters. We see an impact on seniors who are homeowners, and we try to really focus our funds, our disaster recovery funds, into those two areas, if not more. We were able to deploy about $3 billion over this past year for some of the big events we saw last year. Ian is one that stands out, the wildfires that's occurred in California, and the typhoon that occurred in Alaska. So we have been doing everything we can to deploy those billions. And so when states receive those funds, they are required to use them to make sure that we're building back in communities, and also for people who are low and moderate income. That's the terms of engagement. And so there is a huge disparity on the impact of the disasters and disaster events across the country. And one of the things that we do is try to fill that gap in the aftermath. I will say right after a storm, it is our colleagues at FEMA that will come in and the Red Cross to make sure that people are stably housed. And what HUD's job is we're the long game. We make sure that cities, states, developers, nonprofits are receiving funds to build back homes, rental, and sometimes home ownership, and making sure that housing ecosystem remains stabilized.
Another thing that you mentioned that I wanted to ask Clark about was sort of this idea of converting offices to residentials in areas where sort of perhaps there's less office, use these days. That's a pretty big ask, right? I mean, it takes a lot to actually do that. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how much you're hearing about that and what it actually takes to do those kinds of conversions?
There are a few people attempting to convert particularly office into multifamily space, but it's really difficult. A group of young graduating students at Stanford formed a company called Kit Switch, and they put together sort of a kit that could go into these internal office spaces and still create the proper baths and so on, and so that people could perhaps habitate there. But the ventilation systems, everything that has to be done, it's very complicated. I think probably the greater solution is just giving multifamily zoning approval to dead commercial space. That's what's going to have the greatest impact over time, is just seeing more of those buildings that are sort of obsolete being torn down and put into housing, instead of saying, holding on to the dream that they're going to be back into retail or office later. I think that'll have the greatest impact as cities and municipalities look at it.
This question of zoning seems to be a big one in this conversation around sort of how do we get more housing? How do we get in particular more housing that's affordable for sort of low and middle income people? Rachel, Chris, I'd love to sort of hear from both of you about sort of how big a deal zoning is, and sort of what cities, states, towns are sort of making the most interesting progress on that front.
Chris, would you like to go first? Zoning is my passion.
Follow your passion.
Zoning is the tool that our communities use to determine what can be built and what cannot be built. And that translates into who can live there and who does not have the opportunity to live there. In Massachusetts, we adopted a law over 50 years ago that requires every community to have 10% of their housing stock be affordable. That's just one step in addressing exclusionary zoning. Zoning is rooted in segregation. It's shaped by redlining, and the effects of decades of lost wealth building for people of color, especially Black households, last for generations. And it perpetuates just how hard it is having these high barriers to entry in so many of our communities, where single family homes, which are more expensive, are the only types of homes that can be built without these approval processes. So this leaves many communities out of reach. Now, to create affordable housing, you need a few components. You need zoning, you need financing, and you need operating subsidies for rentals to come down really much lower in the rents, or down payment assistance to help first-time home buyers. So you could have the financing and the resources. If you don't have the zoning, you're not able to move forward on meeting those other needs and addressing your goals. But Chris, I turn it to you, who has also just gone through a big zoning change in your own community.
Yeah, I'll give that as an example. And I think it shows how state laws can help change the tenor of a conversation. So Rachel already made reference to the fact that Massachusetts passed a law that said these 177 communities served by the transit system have to zone minimum areas as of right for higher density housing, 16 units per acre. So my town, Lexington, Mass, it's a well-to-do suburb with a great school system just outside of Boston. The planning department took this up, the planning committee, of how do we implement this? They had a charrette. They pulled in residents of the community and said, where would you want to see this kind of higher density housing? I think they were overwhelmed by the degree to which people came in very open to the idea that we ought to have more higher density housing. Now, mind you, we're not talking about skyscrapers, right? We're talking about 16 units per acre, 3-story density would achieve that in a lot of places. And people recognize the fact that we need to have a broader range of housing types for young people, for older people who are getting to the empty nest phase of life. And so my community actually went beyond the minimum and expanded how much area they rezoned to this higher density housing, recognizing that it met the need for more varieties of housing types in locations that are walkable to help revitalize commercial centers. And so my town, I'm very proud of them, have actually been cited in the Boston Globe as an example, leading edge of how it is that the towns can embrace this. But the state law made it possible to have that conversation. Whereas before, the planning board would have to say, here's why we think we ought to do this, why this is in the interest of the broader region to do this. Now they're saying the state's asking us to do this, and let's take it on and let's do it right. I just also want to give a shout out. Senator Wiener mentioned Bill McKibben. Bill McKibben grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, and he also commented on this planning proposal that was passed.
Right. Speaking of Senator Wiener, he also talked about the other kinds of housing that we need. So multifamily is critical. Communities need to allow accessory dwelling units, permanent supportive housing, smaller homes on smaller lots, 2 families and triple deckers, like Chris was just talking about. So, for too long, we've said no in our communities, and this is hurting our ability to thrive. So it's time to say yes. Prioritize development that's affordable, that's sustainable, fosters diversity and inclusion, and supports the local economy, like Chris was talking about.
Right. And we like yes. I mean, I want to say that while zoning is such a hyper local piece of work, HUD is now the steward of a brand new program that is called Yes in My Backyard, YIMBY. I think we're probably going to rename it, but at the moment, it's YIMBY was included in our 23 appropriations, and it's basically funds to really continue the good work that you're hearing here in terms of zoning change and try to incentivize those localities and states that are not doing this, not making these changes, to perhaps do it in the future. So we understand the core importance of zoning to make all these things happen, and we're, as a federal government, going to try to incentivize that across the country.
Samantha, if I might, I think Rachel's point was well taken too. Zoning is the beginning point, right? We need to be able to enable a greater variety of housings with a much simpler process. We also need to think about having subsidies to make it possible. But here I might turn to Clark. The other thing we can't lose sight of the fact is it's too bloody expensive to build housing itself. And so Clark and the Ivy Foundation, the Ivy Prize, has really been surfacing a lot of innovation in the actual construction process itself. And Clark, I don't know if you want to say anything about what you've gleaned from the many companies you've reviewed over the last few years.
I think that for decades, housing has been sort of stuck in the mud. I mean, truthfully, we as builders have not been very innovative. We've done what's always worked. We haven't had to really evolve too quickly. And yet all of a sudden, even in mainstay USA, not the coastal areas, but the entire country now is seeing all kinds of issues with these affordability challenges. And we're waking up to the fact that we need to innovate. And so 5 years ago, we started an initiative, and Chris has been terrific at helping us, where we're shining a light on the best innovators in the country when it comes to housing affordability. We've probably looked at 50 modular companies that are doing all kinds of amazing things with factory-built components and building entire housing and multifamily projects inside a factory or warehouse. And it's interesting. It's just starting to take hold. We're seeing enormous inroads. Even 3D printing, which had never been conceived of for housing, has been now tested over the last few years. And I visited a project in Arizona just 2 months ago, where they have $1 million apparatus above a 6,000 square foot lot building a concrete home that will be very affordable. Well, they have to hit a certain scale. These things are just coming forward. All kinds of new products, I think, will come out in the next decade. We'll see new approaches to modular construction. And if you want to check out ivoryinnovations.org, you'll see a lot of these companies that are doing the very best. And I think the best thing we can do is encourage imitation. This is not an area where we want to just say we've got a monopoly on this. This is where we've got to say, we're all in this together. We've got to collaborate. We've got to come together. And it's zoning and regulatory reform, but it's also finance. There are unique financial solutions that need to be supported by HUD, that need to be supported by our banking industry. There's all kinds of new approaches that we need to press hard for. And I think that we've got a lot of good things happening. Even in regulatory reform, the push for ADUs has just sort of we're seeing a wave of that across the country right now. And it's part of the solution. There are hundreds of little innovations that need to be brought to the fore right now. And I think it's just starting to take, and hopefully we'll see a lot of progress in the next 10 years, because we haven't seen much in the last 30.
I want to talk more about solutions with the sort of 15 or so minutes that we have left. And Deputy Secretary Todman, I'm curious in particular to talk about sort of what you see as, what you're thinking about as potential sort of additional work that HUD and the federal government, states can be doing to try to actually make some kind of progress on the racial homeownership gaps. Because as Dan was talking about, there has been very little progress on that. About 74% of white households are homeowners compared to just 46% of Black households and 49% of Latin households. I feel like I've heard a lot of talk about potential solutions over the years, but we haven't seen much progress. So I'm curious what else you think could or needs to happen.
No, so I will get to that question one second. I just want to pick up on the innovation piece very quickly. And Chris, I don't know if you had an opportunity to join us 3 weeks ago when we hosted our innovation housing showcase right on the National Mall. So Clark, we had ADUs, tiny homes, talk about trying to, really get to scale. We had ADUs, tiny homes, modular housing on the National Mall to really get folks both on the Hill and just the American public to see what's possible. And
thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and folks are seeing that. In addition to that, we have some ask out there in the industry and folks like yourself on what does it mean to do small dollar loans as well. So we're catching up. Things haven't changed in the past couple of decades, but HUD is here to help. As it relates to trying to close the racial homeownership gap, I mean, this is something that is paramount for our secretary. It is one thing that she continues to hone in on, and we are having some results. I mentioned earlier the reduction in our MIP, our mortgage insurance premium, to try to make sure that for first-time homeowners, they're able to take those first steps, and just trying to sort of like not reverse the impact of the interest rates, but just trying to keep up with the impact of the interest rates. We talked about what we're doing on student loans and recalculating the creditworthiness of individuals to look at their actual student loan amounts and not a percentage. We looked at the positive rental payment rate as well. We're also, it was the state senator mentioned this, our affirmatively furthering fair housing. We are just finished our proposed rules. We're taking a look at some of the comments that we have, and it is this administration's intent to get that rule across the finish line to really begin to make sure that we are encouraging all of HUD's grantees, localities, and states to do the right thing and be in neighborhoods and places where we need to be. But the other thing that we're doing is just educating people about the tools that the federal government have and what's possible. Many people don't have access to information, particularly first-time homeowners. They see the dollar amounts, they hear about the down payment needs, and they kind of freeze. And so one of the things that we did actually during the showcase on the mall was had one of the secretaries, she called them house parties, which is really to speak to the next generation of homeowners and the tools that we have available, which includes down payment assistance as well. And so we are trying to find those solutions in those very discrete areas where we see that there are barriers, and we think that it's working.
Actually, I'd like to add, the Deputy Secretary, they're doing so much. I had another issue that the Secretary and Deputy Secretary are highlighting or elevating is appraisal discrimination. So I don't know if you'd like to talk about that, but I've been really impressed just about uplifting this issue so that we can address it and make sure that people can have a more level playing field in homeownership.
Absolutely. And the top line to that is, you know, given the history of this country, you have homes that are in white neighborhoods being assessed at 20% more than homes that are in Black and brown neighborhoods. So we're trying to just even the playing field and looking at the impact of appraisal bias in terms of lost wealth over generations. So it's work that's been spearheaded by DPC and HUD and our secretary. There's a lot of information on HUD's website for anybody who feels they're being discriminated against because of appraisal bias. And there is tools for you to use to get a new appraisal and make sure that you are not losing out on your wealth building.
Clark, I'd love to hear from you a little bit. You've talked some about potential solutions or about solutions that you see. I'm curious what else you think would particularly make a difference from your perspective as someone who is actually building homes.
Well, I think the biggest need, and I think Chris touched on this before, and these folks are doing amazing things in their own areas. I mean, I think we've got to have a culture of openness. We have to have a culture that allows change and innovation. And I think more and more we're going to see people recognizing that this has come to a crisis state in terms of housing affordability. And when your own children and grandchildren have no prospects of being able to afford a home, let alone even rent, then all of a sudden you get motivated in another way. And I think that's what's changed our own dynamic in our own state. And I think it's changing in many states across the country. We have to have more collaboration. And I think that we're going to see more of that. There has to be a more bipartisan effort. I think there has to be state and cities cooperating more than they ever have before. Truthfully, they've been resistant to one another, and I think they have to come together. And we're trying to encourage that in our own area, and it's having a lot of impact. We know we can push a lot of things through at the state level, but if we don't get buy-in at the local level, then it really doesn't have the same impact. So collaboration, I think, is the most important thing. And just sharing examples and opportunities and innovations that are happening around the country. California and Massachusetts and a few of these coastal states have really been leaders. We need to look to their best ideas, and we need to learn from them what to do and also what not to do. Because the reality is a lot of these coastal areas have made a lot of big mistakes, and now they're trying to make up for it. Some of us in other states that are later to the game have an opportunity to not make some of the same mistakes and to push that forward. So I'm very optimistic that this is really at the forefront right now, that a lot of people are going to get involved. And that's probably what is most encouraging to me. I think there will be a lot of technology that will benefit us. The large home builders have been resistant to this in the past, but I've actually seen in the last 2 or 3 years, the biggest builders are actually starting to look at all of these companies that we have been, shining a light on. They're now looking at funding some of their growth. They're looking at investing in some of their processes and bringing them into their own companies. So I think it's just starting to happen in terms of construction and design innovation. I think regulatory reform, there's enough pressure from a broader base that I think we might see that. And then I hope on the financial level, we can have some new innovations. I mean, I think we've heard from the secretary some great things that are happening, but we need something that's really dramatic. The 30-year mortgage is probably the most dramatic thing that we've seen in the last, 100 years to impact housing. But we need something like that. We need something that will change the dynamic of affordability. And maybe it is a longer term in terms of financing. Maybe it is just different approaches in terms of down payment assistance. I think there has to be a lot of different things that are looked at all of these levels: financial, regulatory reform, and construction.
We've been talking a lot, almost exclusively about home ownership, but obviously a large percentage of people in this country still rent, myself included. And Chris, I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about how the housing market of the last few years, the just run up in costs on sort of the for sale side, has also affected the renters in this country, and sort of where that is right now.
Yes, and I just want to, echo your point about a lot of people rent. A lot of people rent because they want to. It's a lifestyle that suits them, whether they're younger or older and not looking to take care of a home or looking to move quickly, or financially it's the best choice. So we really do need to pay attention to the rental market and make sure it's providing good quality, affordable housing. It's well located. What's happened to renters is that, you mentioned that house prices are up 40% over the last few years. Rents are up by 28 or 30% over the last few years. And so rents are not divorced from house prices. House prices go up, rents tend to go along with them. If they don't, we got a big problem. But so we've seen rents go up, and renter incomes have not gone up by nearly that amount. And so what we've seen, we had seen rental affordability really deteriorate through the early part of the century and coming out of the Great Recession. It's slowly gotten better, and it's a little bit like the old thing about the lobster boiling in a pot. The water was like no longer a rapid boil, it was a low boil, but it was getting better. The last 2 years it's just reversed. We've seen now the number of cost-burden renters shoot up to near record level. And given what we're seeing, these things are measured with a lag. And given what's happening in the market, rents have slowed down a lot, but they're still going up, and incomes aren't keeping up. So I expect to see the numbers for the next year to say that affordability has gotten worse. And what does that mean? As Matt Desmond put it, the rent eats first. And so after you pay that rent, which you have to pay to keep that roof over your head, what do you have left over to pay for everything else? And if it's not enough to pay for everything else, something's got to give. And you know what gives most? Food, healthcare, transportation, things that you need to survive. One of the startling numbers in this report is we look at people making less than $30,000 a year. Now, mind you, $30,000 a year is modest, but it still means you're working full-time year-round at something like twice the minimum wage, federal minimum wage. So people making $30,000, after they pay their rent, they have $380 left a month for everything else. That's not a lot to meet life's necessities. And so the squeeze that's happening in the housing market, we've talked a lot about first-time buyers, and that's an issue, but the squeeze that's happening to renters, and particularly low-income renters, is squeezing out some really fundamental necessities of life.
Absolutely. We only have a couple minutes left. I want to kind of give each of you a chance to just close out on whatever point you haven't had a chance to make and that you would really like everybody to sort of take away today. Clark, I'll start with you.
Well, I think we've got to be careful to protect our existing affordable housing stock. The natural affordable housing has got to be protected. Just to get to Chris's point, there's two ways to really serve people at the very lowest end of the ladder. Those that only, are spending 50% of their income on housing. And that is, we have to take the existing stock and protect it. We need housing preservation. We need funds in order to do that. We need to be able to make those buildings more sustainable as well. So I think there needs to be federal effort that comes in a strong way to preserve affordable housing. We can't have LIHTC deals turning over and expiring and going back to market. We've got to protect all of the affordable housing. That's number one. Number two, I think, developers have a hard time reaching a price point that can be affordable these days. FHA loans are critical, the 40-year term and all the rest of it. We need to expand those programs so that there's more long-term financing available to do affordable housing. And I think we've got to also give encouragement to cities and counties to do more of this. And if they have more funding that goes in this direction, then we can have more collaboration with nonprofits and with for-profit developers who will come forward and develop this kind of housing. So I think it's a big deal overall. Everyone's hurt, but no one is hurt more than those who are at the very bottom end and who are spending 50% or more of their income on housing. And that's where we've really got to make a dent. And that will have the greatest impact on homelessness, which was talked about earlier as well.
Yeah. Deputy Secretary Todman, a last sort of minute, if you've got it.
Sure, great. I know the audience that watches this broadcast. I often sat on the other side of this event, and so you all are some of the smartest and brightest folks helping to take on housing issues across the country. I ask you to pay attention to the things that HUD's doing. We have a new regulatory agenda. We encourage all of your voices as we look to try to take on all the things that we just talked about from the rental and home ownership parts of our system. We are pushing out dollars. We have $1 billion out there for our green and resilient retrofit program to help our project-based owners be able to update their homes. And so if you are a PBRA owner, please come on in and apply, but also continue to just be part of our conversation. We have our stakeholder meetings as well. HUD is only as good as being able to understand what's happening out there in Clark's world, in Rachel's world. And so the more of you who are at the table talking to us and really responding to what we're doing at the federal government level only means our tools become stronger.
Rachel?
Right now is a time to do all of the things. We need to produce more homes and be intentional about affordability. We need to preserve the affordable homes we've got, both our public housing stock, our subsidized affordable housing, those naturally occurring affordable housing buildings that exist that Clark was talking about, acquiring them. We need to plan for more. And we really need to remember this is all about people and listening to people who are experiencing the pain that we are talking about, that Chris talked about, the choices people make, and ensuring that we really are putting people at the center and coming up with solutions alongside the people who are experiencing the problems.
Thank you so much. And Chris, final word?
Everyone said it so well. Only thing I would say is that we referenced this, it's taken us a long time to get into this problem. It's going to take us a long time to get out. So people do need to be patient, but they need to be perseverant. And I think, echoing what Rachel said, we need a yes and attitude, because there's not one solution to the housing crisis. People often say, what's the silver bullet? In housing, we need silver buckshot. And we have to say yes and to all the things that we need to do. And we need to be persistent. But I think and we're going to be persistent with policy, people like Deputy Secretary Todman, industry like Clark Ivory, and advocacy like Rachel Heller. I appreciate all of them joining us today, because we need all of us rowing together to get this done.
I have a million more questions for all of you, but unfortunately we have to leave it there. That's all the time we have. Thank you all so much for joining us. All of our panelists, everyone on the Zoom. The full report is available on the Joint Center's website, and there is also a lot of data, interactive maps, and tools. I encourage you all to check it out. Chris, Dan, all of our guests, thank you all so much for being here. Enjoy the day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.